Good evening, everybody. I'm Noelle Osen, and I just want to welcome you to the Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones monthly presentation. But before we introduce our guest speaker for this evening, we just have a few short announcements. I'd like to remind everyone that next month we actually start live again at the Portage District Library. Our meeting room is at the lower level, and we will begin social hour at 6 o'clock, and the program begins at 6:30. We're also preparing for the spring plant sale. You can find details on our website, and there will also be information in our March seedlings. And lastly, this evening, we will have the chat disabled. Would you please put all of your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to all of them after the end of the program. Now, I'd like to turn the program over to Tom Small to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Noelle. I first encountered David Karowe over 20 years ago. And after I became seriously engaged with trying to educate people about climate change, I encountered him more and more often. And in the course of making some noise around the community, I acquired a somewhat specious reputation as an expert, and people started calling on me to speak to organizations and meetings. And I knew just enough at that time to know that I really didn't quite know what I was talking about, and that Dave Karowe did. That he was the expert and I wasn't. So I would agree to speak, but only on the condition that Dave would come along with me and provide the information. And I would provide, on the course of the evening, a little bit of the enthusiasm. And Dave would provide the rest. Dave's been a good friend and a good friend to Wild Ones for a long time. He first spoke to us as part of a panel back in 2008. And he has come and spoken to us since then 2 more times, I think, about 2013, 2018 or 19. And now he's back again for this evening, once again. Dave has been a leader on campus and off. On campus, he's been a leader in developing interdisciplinary programs, both undergraduate and graduate level, on climate change, and also in promoting all kinds of meaningful and informed university and community responses to the climate emergency, the long emergency that we're all living in. He continues to be a leader of the WMU Faculty Climate Change Working Group, Kalamazoo Climate Change Coalition, and the other organizations for more than 30 years. Dave Karowe has been a tireless speaker and panelist, spreading the message throughout Michigan and the Midwest that climate change will be the most serious environmental challenge to human history, with profound global and local implications for ecosystems, human health and well-being, and society. And he's been a good friend to Wild Ones as well, a good friend to all of us. And it's with pleasure that I welcome, and please join me in welcoming our friend, Dave Karowe, back to Wild Ones.
That was probably my favorite introduction that I've ever heard of me. I did not think of us as, I thought it was always as equal partners, equal contributors when we did presentations together. So your input was very valuable, I thought, and to me personally as well. And I love getting invitations to talk about the effects of climate change on something that I haven't really focused on yet. And so when Tom asked me to speak about effects of climate change on native plants, yeah, I was happy to accept because it meant I was going to have to learn a lot. It's not something that is my particular area of research or teaching, but close. And so the presentation that I've put together for tonight is basically a new presentation, which means there may be some glitches as we go along. If so, I hope you'll understand. And also, I want to just preface the presentation by saying that there are very few studies that address the fate of native versus non-native plants under future climate change. There's an awful lot of observation of things that have already happened and speculation about what will happen in the future, basically a continuation of the phenomena that we've already seen. But I won't be able to talk about any kind of comprehensive study that looks at the native flora of any particular place, and in particular, not in contrast to invasives. But we'll address it where we can. So I will start. Oops, sorry guys. Forgot to tell Zoom to share it. Okay, can everybody see that? Yeah, okay.
Looks good.
Okay, so what have been and will be in the future the effects of climate change on native plants? Sometimes we'll have to draw from examples of native plants in other areas than our own, but we should have a fairly good understanding of at least some of the effects by the time we're done with this talk. One of the things we should ask is, have they already been experiencing climate change? And of course, not just natives have, everything on Earth has. But I always like to start out by showing this video, which is basically a 30-second video put together by NASA, actually the Goddard Institute of Space Sciences. And what it shows is change in temperature over time, starting in 1880, which is really when we started to have a good global record of temperature, and running through this past year. What the colors depict is during that year, or that it's actually a 5-year running mean, but during that time, what was the temperature of any place on Earth like compared to the temperature of that same place on average from 1950 to 1980? So basically, this is difference from 1950 to 1980 temperatures over time for every place on the planet. And we'll just take a look at what's been happening with the warming part of climate change. You can see, of course, the years go by at the bottom. So unequivocally, yes, native plants and everything on our planet has been experiencing what amounts to incredibly rapid temperature increases, more rapid than any we know of in the last 2 million years at least. In the PDF, if I remember to include it, will be the link to this video. I think it's a good thing to show other people if they're at all skeptical. Okay, so we know that this past year was the warmest year on record. And that is not by itself all that surprising. What was very surprising was by how much it smashed the previous record. So it was the warmest year on record. The previous one that globally had been 2000 and so I get them mixed up. 2012, no, that was the highest, warmest for us. 2016 was the warmest globally until 2023. And we can see the pattern of difference from normal across the entire planet for the full year 2023. So this is how much colder, which almost didn't happen anywhere, and how much warmer every place was relative to its average from the 20th century. And what we can see is that there's an awful lot of red and orange, very little blue. And in our area, 2023 was clearly warmer than normal. It was 1 to 2 degrees C warmer than normal. One of the reasons it didn't maybe feel that way is because the warming was primarily in the cold parts of the year. We did not get an unusually warm summer, but we did get, as you guys probably remember, an unusually warm spring and fall and winter. Okay, so we and the plants around us are experiencing fairly remarkable climate change, at least in terms of temperature. NOAA divides the U.S. or the lower 48 into different climate regions. The upper Midwest, you can look on their website and generate this sort of pattern. What has been happening with temperature in the upper Midwest? Clearly, it's been increasing with a lot of year-to-year variation. And overall, it's increased by about 1.1 degrees Celsius since 1900. That's pretty much the global average. We're not going to stay at the global average. We will warm faster in the future than the global average, but for now we've been keeping pace, except that the rate of warming in our area has gone up more than double. It's 2.5 times as fast as it had been for the entire record. So we're speeding up, and that can't be good news, I think, for any life form in our area. What about precipitation? That's the other big component of climate. And precipitation, first of all, it's a lot harder to measure, varies a lot more than temperature over short distances and over short time periods. But the general pattern that's emerging is that precipitation, average precipitation has been increasing at high northern latitudes and generally decreasing at low latitudes. So more precipitation where we are, less in the tropics and subtropics. And in fact, in our area, in the Great Lakes region, most of our region has seen since 1985 somewhere between a 5 and 15% increase in precipitation. It may sound like a good thing, and it probably is, but a big problem is that a lot of that increase, probably most of it, is due to an increase in severe precipitation events, which put a lot of water on the ground in a very short time, and that's not really very helpful for ecosystems. Most of it runs off, and so we get flooding. Catastrophic flooding is now fairly commonplace, actually, in the Midwest, also in the Northeast. And these are the kinds of conditions that native plants are having to deal with more and more. At the same time, globally, there's clearly been an increase in drought. Droughts have become more frequent, they're longer lasting and more severe while they are happening. This is change in the most common measure of drought intensity, the Palmer Drought Severity Index. Basically, red means droughts have been increasing, blue, green means droughts have been decreasing. And in our region, actually, so globally, there's been a huge increase in the amount of surface area that in at least moderate drought, 20% of the surface to 30% of the land surface. But that hasn't been happening in our backyard. Okay? We've actually been in general experiencing less frequent and less intense droughts. Okay, so that's what some of the ways in which climate's been changing recently. And we can ask, first question is, have native plants noticed this? Have they already been responding to climate change? Whether we're talking about native plants or pretty much anything, there are three types of responses that have been documented. One is moving around on the surface, geographic range shifts, which we'll just call range shifts from now on. And in general, the range shifts should be poleward. And we can ask, have they been? And also, have they been fast enough? Climate's moving poleward. Have species been moving at a similar rate? Another response is changing when you do certain important things, important parts of your life cycle, like flowering. So when do you put out your first flowers? When do you put out your first leaves? When do you drop your leaves in the fall? Changes in the seasonal timing of these kinds of events are referred to as phenological changes. And we have more evidence of phenological shifts than geographic shifts. And then the last is change in population size. And in this case, I would restrict attention to one's changes in population size that can, with some confidence, be attributed to climate change. Those are not very common. One thing that's really important is that species within the same ecological community are responding in different ways. They may be showing different phenological shifts. We'll see some evidence of that in a second. And they certainly may be moving at different rates and even in different directions. So it's not like the communities that we know are necessarily going to stay together in the future, either in space or in time. Okay, so for plants, most documented range shifts have actually been elevational shifts. They've been up to higher altitude. Why? Because you can look, you know exactly where the range of the northern hardwoods ends, and all you have to do is basically look once a year, and you can tell whether it's moving up or down. Okay, you have to be a little more precise than that, but it's much easier to notice and document an elevational range shift than a latitudinal one. You never know if you have observed the northernmost occurrence of a species. So anyway, it makes sense that most of the documented range shifts would be altitudinal. Here is an example from the Vermont mountains, where the transition between the hardwoods and conifer forests has moved up about 100 meters over, it was a 40-year span. This is actually easily seen in aerial photographs over that time. Of course, the upslope shifts may not be possible all the way to the top of the mountain, because it may be that soils or other abiotic factors, wind and so on, may prevent the lower elevation species from actually being able to survive. So elevational shifts almost certainly will be limited to some extent. And in Europe, a larger number of species, 170 species, where 27% of them shifted significantly upslope over a century, 1905 to 2005. The way to interpret this is, like it says, triangles are statistically significant shifts. Most of them are above the no shift line. This line is same elevation now as it used to be. So most of them are moving up. Some are moving significantly downslope. It's not at all clear why that's happening. But the bottom line is only 27% are showing a significant upslope movement. Only 27% are going in the direction that would be good for them. The ones that have moved upslope the fastest are small plants that have short life cycles. It's probably no surprise. If we look closer to home and ask, well, what's been happening with native trees east of the Mississippi, or at least in the eastern U.S., turns out that a recent study of 86 native tree species showed that only about a third have shifted significantly northward in the last 30 years. This is a little bit of a weird figure. The arrows, each arrow is a species, and the origin of the arrow is where its range center used to be. The tip of the arrow is where its range center is now. And if it is a black arrow, it's a not significant shift. If it's a green arrow, that shift includes a significant northward component, red significant southward. What we'd like to see is all green arrows, all pointing more or less due north, but that's not what trees have been doing. In fact, more have shifted significantly westward than significantly northward. For instance, these you can see a number of green arrows that are mostly going west. So what we want to see in this figure is the green arrow significantly northward. There are some generalizations that if you're wind pollinated, you have a better chance of being one of the species that has shifted significantly north than if you're animal pollinated. Also, if you're a conifer, you have a greater chance of having shifted north than if you are a deciduous tree. Which ones have been shifting north the most? Aspens, some of the pines, and birches, all of the birches actually. The Populus genus is the one that's been moving north faster than any other. It's been moving north at about 46 kilometers a decade over this 30-year span. The genus Pinus has been moving, but a little bit less than half as fast. And birches are moving north, but again, about half as fast as pine. And of course, if 35% have shifted north, that means 65% have not yet. And almost all of the northward shifts, with the exception of the Populus species, the observed northward shifts are just not fast enough to keep pace with the climate, which is moving in general about as fast as the Populus. So Pinus and Betula are moving north, but half, maybe a quarter as fast as their climate is. They're not able to keep up. Wisconsin, same thing. But here we have, instead of woody plants, we have forest understory herbaceous plants, 80% of which have shifted northward since 1950. Here, each arrow represents a species, and what we have here are, as you can see, mostly northward or northwestern shifts. And you'll have to excuse me. My cat is thinking it's time for her dinner. But that may be a recurring problem throughout the I hope she doesn't step on the keyboard. Okay, so this is what those understory herbaceous native plants have been doing in Wisconsin. That's their movement, their geographic range shifts since 1950. This is how their climates have shifted. And what you can see is that those sets of arrows are not identical. And in general, these understory native species are shifting more or less in the right direction, but very few of them are going in exactly the right direction. And none of them is going fast enough. On average, the range shifts are about half as far and as fast as the climate has been shifting. So those are geographic range shifts. One of the things that's probably easier to observe is phenological shifts. You just have to look again at the same place. You know where to look. When is in the woods that I walk every spring, what has happened to first flowering time for native species? Okay, there's some more comprehensive reports than others in Massachusetts and Wisconsin both. Springs have been getting warmer, and warmer springs have led generally to earlier first flowering dates for native species. This is the average of 32 native species in each of the years, the spring temperature for that year along the bottom, the mean flowering date, and clearly as the spring temperature has gotten warmer, the flowering date has shifted earlier. In Wisconsin, basically exactly the same pattern. And in this case, 23 natives were included in this data set. There is some attempt to standardize phenological observations. Some of you may be part of the Phenological Observation Network, National Phenological Observation Network, and you may be contributing data to that. If so, fantastic. There is an attempt to standardize the plant that you're looking at, or that is being analyzed. And for some reason, lilacs have been chosen as the plant that should be most thoroughly observed. I think it has a wide enough geographic range that it can tell us what's happening in different places in the lower 48. And it turns out that throughout the northern US, lilacs are putting out their first leaves 4 to 8 days earlier than in 1950. Warm colors are earlier a shift to earlier in the spring. The darker the red or orange, and the bigger the circle, the greater the shift. What we see is everywhere except the southeast, south central, there's been a shift towards earlier first leaf date. For some reason, not in the southeast. It's actually not well understood yet why plants in the southeast are behaving differently. Southeast has not been warming as fast as others, but it has been warming. And so it's not clear why phenology would be shifting later. Autumn phenology, leaf fall, is harder to I think observe. It's hard to know when was the last leaf. When did the last leaf leave the tree? And also, how different was it in different individuals of the tree? Anyway, despite that kind of noise that gets worked into the observations, what we do see is that all in all, there's been an extension of leaf time into the fall. So leaves are falling a bit later. I don't know if any of you had this issue this year, but at the time the city leaf collection was scheduled, our leaves hadn't fallen yet. So they rescheduled for later. That's just in acknowledgement that fall phenology is also getting later. And it turns out that where we have information about changing population sizes, that plant species that have been tracking climate change through phenological shifts have been showing larger phenological shifts to earlier in the spring. They've done better than species that haven't been tracking climate change very well. Best data set comes from Thoreau Woods. It's 150 years of phenological observations and also population censuses. And it's quite clear that the species that are declining the most are the ones that have not shown phenological advancement. There are many reasons they may be declining, but this looks like an important one. And there's a phylogenetic signal. There are some groups of plants that seem to be relatively poor at tracking climate phenologically, including members of the blueberry, cherry, and dogwood families. Of course, what really matters is what are their pollinators doing, and those data aren't available. It is fairly clear from Thoreau Woods that invasive species and other non-native species have actually shown the greatest phenological advancement and the largest population increases. For instance, stinking chamomile has done quite well. It's not clear whether the population increase is due to its phenological tracking. Probably some of it is, but as for either lack or expression of phenological shifts, or population declines, we don't really know how much phenology is responsible. One of the more recent additions to this research is to focus on more than just the first flower or the first leaf out. So phenology has mostly been about firsts up to now, but there are other things that are part of a species phenology. So first flowering has been most frequently observed. Peak flowering, it's harder. You have to follow flowering for the whole flowering season, and last flowering also less observed than first flowering. So here are some species in the Rocky Mountains for which there is information on their phenological shifts, number of days per year. Negative is doing it earlier, positive is doing it later, and for which there are data on first, peak, and last flowering. So we can look at a Heracleum species. It has advanced by similar margins. Its date of first flowering, its date of peak flowering, and its date of last flowering. So it's kind of shifted all of its flowering forward in time to about the same extent. In contrast, Aquileia hasn't changed its first flowering or peak flowering, and it has significantly delayed its last flowering. So you can see at a glance that, well, first of all, blue symbols that are filled in with blue are statistically significant changes. And the one thing that's clear is species are doing different things in terms of first flowering, in terms of peak flowering, in terms of last flowering. So whatever patterns of temporal overlap used to be the case for these Rocky Mountain native species, those patterns are becoming messed up. or they're at least changing, let's put it that way. So among the changes are some species that now overlap a lot more with other species. So bracted lousewort here has a lot more of its flowering time that overlaps with the flowering time of other species in that community. In contrast, mountain bluebell has a lot less overlap in flowering times with other species in its community. What are the consequences going to be? Unclear. If you overlap a lot more with many species than you used to, then probably you're going to experience greater competition for pollinators. There is also a phenomenon known as pollinator facilitation, where the average number of visits per flower actually goes up if you've got a lot of other things flowering in the area, because it draws in pollinators from a distance. But anyway, we don't know what the consequence will be for pollination efficiency, and that's crucial for these plants, of course. Now, we've been talking about phenological shifts in the plants. What about phenological shifts in the pollinators, and in particular, levels of synchrony or asynchrony between the plants and their mutualists? In New York, and I realize apple is not a native species, but this is a good long-term data set. Apple and its 7 major pollinators have, on average, both advanced about 2 days per decade since 1970. Okay, here's the average. I'll show you. Here's what's happening to apple peak flowering time and pollinator peak flight time. The pollinators are a little behind apple, but that distance, that level of asynchrony hasn't changed much. It's basically the same as it was in 1970. And one of the things that apple has going for it is that it's got a lot of pollinators. And so even though those pollinators have shifted differently, there's still about the same amount of overlap of the pollinator community with apple. Okay, so each line here represents the phenological shift of a different pollinator species from 1960-ish to almost 2020. And you can see that so 0 is no shift, negative is they're flying earlier in the year, positive is they're flying later relative to apple. And some pollinators have been shifting to be more synchronous with apple. The dotted line would be perfect synchrony between peak flight of the pollinator and peak flowering of the apple. So some have become more synchronous, others have become less synchronous. But the bottom line is that diversity, so here's one pollinator, here's another, this has become more synchronous with apple, that one less synchronous. And this suggests that native species that have multiple pollinators are probably going to do better in terms of avoiding mismatch, timing mismatch, than those that have 1 or 2 pollinators. In Germany, there's an example of really quite a bit of ecological asynchrony, of phenological mismatch developing in the last 50 years. Pasque has been advancing its flowering by, in this case, it's not per decade or per year, per degree warming. So 13 days earlier per degree of warming, but its major pollinator only 4 days per degree of warming. So that looks like a native plant, not for us, but for Europe, that may already be experiencing harmful levels of asynchrony with at least some of their pollinators, their major pollinators. In Japan, there's an interesting study with Cordalis species and a bumblebee species, where the earlier the snow melt, the greater the mismatch between this pollinator and this plant and its major pollinator. So the x-axis is snow melt, day of the year, and the y-axis is onset of flowering or bee emergence. And the earlier the snow melt, so the farther to the left, the greater the temporal separation between onset of flowering and emergence of bees. So why is that happening? The plant responds pretty directly to snow melt, loss of snow on the surface. The bee is overwintering a few inches, maybe 6 or 8 inches underground, and it responds to temperature. That's what tells it it's time to come out. And the temperature doesn't rise immediately when the snow has melted. So that asynchrony, that mismatch, is increasing as spring snowmelt happens earlier. It's probably happening for plant pollinator systems in the Rocky Mountains. It's probably happening in Michigan too, but we don't know. So the flowering of Cordalis is determined by the timing of snowmelt, but the emergence of the short-tongued bumblebee by soil temperature, which doesn't increase as rapidly as the snowmelt. And so lower seed set actually is discernibly disadvantageous for this plant. The greater the mismatch, the lower the seed set. So actually a real a real important effect of phenological mismatch. Long-term records in Germany, or at least since 1980, indicate that some pollinator groups are doing better at tracking climate change than others. Plants over this period of time have, on average, these are their native wildflowers, have shifted their flowering time 7 days earlier per decade. That's quite a strong shift, and 86% of them are moving to earlier flowering earlier in the spring. Beetles basically haven't shifted at all on average, and less than half of them are going in the right direction. Flies seem to be doing quite well, the best of all of the pollinator groups, 5 days earlier per decade, where 9 out of 10 of them are shifting in that direction. Bees, butterflies, and moths are sort of intermediate. They're lagging way behind the plants. And butterflies and moths are showing a more consistent response than bees. But what it clearly says to me is that native species that are pollinated by beetles are going to probably be in trouble. They'll probably be climate losers in the not too distant future. Oops. Okay, so we'll probably be climate losers in Illinois, probably in Michigan. Here are some species that are that have over a dozen beetle pollinators: goat's beard, homewort, and smooth arrowwood. So who knows? But that, if I had a choice, I would not be beetle pollinated. And one of the things that's happening, in fact, we probably are in one right now, is false springs. And for temperate plants, false springs can be really a problem. What makes a false spring happen? You get abnormally warm temperatures. I think we've just had the warmest February on record. Okay, and that fools plants and insects into believing that it's spring. So they start to do their spring things, like develop leaves, maybe put out flowers. So they initiate early leaf and flower or flower development, but then we get something like today. Fortunately, this isn't going to last very long, fortunately for the plants, but So above the subsequent days above freezing, actually above the developmental threshold, brings those tissues to a vulnerable state. And then a frost occurs or a freeze occurs. And these valuable tissues, young leaves, flowers, get damaged. Fruit farmers in Michigan are probably hurt more by fall springs than anything else. I don't know what the effect is of this weather is going to be on Michigan cherry harvests or peach or whatever, but it may be a big problem. Okay, so what's been happening with fall springs in Illinois? They've been getting a lot more common. Okay, so here's beech with early spring frost damage, and in a particular reserve in Illinois where it's been tracked for a long time, the years with frost damage have increased fairly dramatically. It used to be that there was about a 3% chance of having fall spring, and lately it's been about a 21% chance. It's unclear what's going to happen in the future, but the predictions that are not made with a lot of confidence, quite honestly, generally are that fall springs are likely to increase in our region, the northern Midwest, also in the Great Plains, and also in the eastern forests. It's not just plants that get hurt by fall springs. Their pollinators do as well. Insects in general do. So fall springs can be really lethal to Michigan or temperate zone insects that spend the winter full of antifreeze. They go into their version of hibernation, which is called diapause. And what tells them it's time to go into diapause, which means, okay, synthesize a bunch of antifreeze and go find some place fairly protected to last out the winter. What tells them to do that is shortening day length in the fall. Okay, what happens during a fall spring? They may get fooled into thinking that it is spring, but if they come out at that point, they can't go back into diapause because day length is increasing, not decreasing. So they can't go back into diapause, and instead what happens is there's mass mortality. Pretty much anyone that comes out will die. I think last night, there's probably a huge mortality for Michigan insects. And it's not just spring phenology that can be a problem. The fact that fall is happening later can also be a problem for insect pollinators. Basically, they go into diapause, like I said, based on shrinking day length. So they enter diapause at basically the same time as they always did prior to climate change. But fall temperatures are higher. We just had a really warm fall. And if they're in diapause, their physiological rate, their respiration rate, and so on is basically temperature dependent. So now they're starting out their diapause with potentially a long stretch of time that's pretty pretty warm. And so they're using up their fat reserves pretty fast at the beginning of the diapause, and good possibility they will starve before spring. And of course, both of these amount to a conclusion that I'm sure is not a surprise to you, that rapid emissions reductions, which is basically the only way we can prevent all this, would greatly benefit not only the insects of Michigan, but everything, including native plants that depend on them. Okay, so what's the future look like for Michigan. First of all, everything that we just talked about, it's likely to continue. All of those trends are likely to continue. But there are going to be some additional substantial challenges. Okay, so first of all, in terms of future climate change, the most important thing to realize is it's up to us. It's up to humans how much future climate change there's going to be. So the magnitude of future climate change depends almost entirely on our choice of how much greenhouse gases we're willing to emit. There's three options, three possible futures that are discussed more than others. There's a huge range of possible futures at this point. I'd like to put those three in the context of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels over the last 400,000 years. So 400,000 years ago on the left, today on the right, well, not quite today. These are from ice cores, bubbles trapped in ice cores. So if we look at what happened at atmospheric CO2 levels, over the last 400,000 years, they fluctuated basically between 200 and 300 parts per million. In 1950, they got over 300 parts per million. Current level actually is a bit higher than that. But we can use this as a backdrop or context for thinking about future possibilities. If we continue along our current path and leave many of the voluntary commitments, emissions reduction commitments, unmet, we'll call that the business as usual future, that gets us to about 950 parts per million by end of century. And that would cause somewhere in the range of 4.5 or 5 degrees of warming relative to pre-industrial. Paris Agreement says, nope, we're going to not let atmospheric CO2 levels get above 550 parts per million. And as a consequence, we'll probably keep warming to 2 degrees Celsius. The third alternative is one that doesn't really have a name. I call it Paris Extended. And it is a future where maybe we overshoot, but eventually we stabilize atmospheric CO2 at 450 parts per million, and that's our 1.5 degree warming future. So right now, we and native plants are heading towards a pretty unpleasant future, but, and this is an incredibly important thing to keep in mind, we still can change. Of course, that future we're headed at doesn't have to actually happen. Paris Extended is, of course, a much better future. And what we'll see here is this is by American Geophysical Union, basically the biggest group of climate scientists in our country. So what we'll look at is how temperature is predicted to change under business as usual emissions, or if we curtail emissions quickly and strongly, and therefore meet the Paris Extended. Oh, that didn't work. Oops, sorry guys. Whoever is making the video, perhaps you could cut that part out. Maybe not. Okay, so Paris Extended is a much better future, and here's how temperature is predicted to play out under those two possible futures. And the year is going by inside the black box here. So by mid-century, it's an incredibly different planet, depending on our emissions choices. And of course, that difference gets even bigger as we reach the end of the century. I mean, these are two choices for us, for our native plants, for everything. Do we want to have a future that's like that or this? If we do not actively choose the one on the left, then we're going to get something like the one on the right. So really does take an effort to change our course. What about within the Great Lakes region? So under business as usual, the prediction is we'll warm more than the global average. We'll warm by about 6.5 degrees. BAU stands for business as usual, and at the same time get less precipitation, 10% less. That's a really bad combination of climate changes. Under Paris Agreement, summer temperature only increases by about half as much, by about 3.5 degrees, and summer precipitation decreases by about half as much. So clearly, a Paris Agreement future would be much less stressful for our native species than a business as usual future. If we look at things like extreme heat, aggressive emissions reductions would dramatically reduce the number of very hot days, extremely hot days. If we just look by 2050, historically the Midwest has had about 6 days per year over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, not Michigan, but the Midwest in general. Prediction under business as usual is by mid-century, that'll be 30 days a year. And under Paris Agreement, it would be about 22 days a year. What about days over 105 degrees? Again, bigger increase under business as usual than under Paris. No analog levels of heat are ones that just don't happen now. There is no current present analog. It's basically a heat index of about 130 or more. And that would happen sometimes by mid-century under both emission scenarios. The big advantage in terms of extreme heat is later in the century, when the increase is dramatic for business as usual future, substantial but much less dramatic for Paris Agreement future, whether you're talking about 100, 105, or no analog days. Can ask, okay, what are the native plants going to have to deal with in terms of not just days that are hot, but summers that are hot? How many summers in the Great Lakes region by 2070 are predicted to be hotter than what is currently our record hot summer? So this is the prediction for the entire planet, where the colors indicate the probability that summers after 2070 will be hotter than the current record hot summer. And in our region under business as usual, yeah, it's basically 90 to 100% of summers, hotter than any we've experienced. Under Paris Agreement, it's more like, could be as little as 10, maybe up to 50%. It's not a trivial change, but it's certainly not as dramatic a stress for native species as business as usual would cause. So what happens when you artificially warm plants, and in some cases they're pollinators, let's say by 4 degrees? Interesting study using 3 plants that are native to basically the low mid elevation California, and their primary pollinator, which is the blue orchard bee. And it turns out that there were some interesting responses of these plants to being exposed to 4 degrees warmer. First of all, they flowered earlier. Okay, they advanced their phenology, not a surprise. Their peak flowering occurred earlier, again, not a surprise. Here's something that's kind of worrisome. They made fewer flowers, and the ones they made were smaller. And even worse, they had less nectar. Nectar decreased by up to 3/4. So much less reward for the pollinator. And their seed production, as a consequence of all these changes, decreased by up to 25%. What happened to the pollinator? 4 degrees actually didn't change its emergence date. The lower nectar volume made it spend less than half as much time on each flower, becoming a much less efficient pollinator. And also, they became much more opportunistic about which, so they went from one species to another a lot more. And that means a lot of pollen was getting deposited on the stigmas of the wrong species. Okay. I think, Gail, can you let me know how I'm doing on time?
David, it's 7:30 now, so we've been going for about an hour.
Okay, but I didn't start an
Yeah,
hour.
you have a couple more minutes. Don't
Okay.
worry about it. I don't think anybody's going to leave.
Okay. I will skip some slides, I think. Actually, I don't think I need to. Okay, so one of the concerns is for native plants, this isn't going to be native plants, but I'm for sure it is if the winters get too warm, will they experience their chill requirement? And under business as usual, the number of days below freezing is going to decrease dramatically over the entire country. So the darker the red, the greater the loss of freezing days, days below 32 degrees. If we look in our region, by 2090, it's about 65 fewer days below freezing, under business as usual. Will that be a real problem for some native species? I assume it will be, but you guys know better than I what the vernalization requirements are. For cherry, these are, I guess, native. Yeah, cherry, some cherries. I'm blanking on this one. I have one in my yard. Anyway, and blueberries, it may be that without enough days below freezing, they can't flower anymore in Michigan, so can't reproduce. Under business as usual, instead of 65, it's about 35 fewer days, and that may give us back many of our native species. Okay, one thing that is a consequence, things are changing geographic range and phenological timing differently, one species to the other. And that will lead to different levels of overlap. We talked about floral overlap a bit ago, but it also leads to different levels of, or different patterns of co-occurrence among species as their ranges change in a species-specific way. One of the interesting, or maybe most important levels of overlap is with invasive species that are allelopathic, means they secrete toxins into the soil. Okay, so allelopathic invasive species are predicted to do quite well under climate change. Here are 6 that were the focus of this research. And question is, how much is their range predicted to expand? All of them expand under both Paris Agreement and business as usual. And in some cases, it's a pretty dramatic expansion. They're really very strong climate winners. Tree of Heaven, for instance, ironwood. Okay, so they'll be expanding. What does that mean for overlap with our native species? So we have our invasives again. This is it's a little bit of a weird scale. It ranges from 0 to 6. There are 6 in allelopathic invasives. Green areas are where all 6 are predicted to occur in the well, currently where they all do, or will in the future in the next 2 maps. And white is none of them are there. None of them is there now. Okay, so that's the current distribution of these 6 pretty nasty invasives. If we look at that area, which includes our backyard, under the Paris Agreement by 2070, there are a lot, I think you can see there are a lot more dark green areas. There are a lot more areas where all 6 are predicted to occur. And under business as usual, there's even more dark green. So they lose their southern range, but they become more common and more widely distributed in the northern parts of their range. So that's going to be, and presumably going to be, a big challenge of the future is dealing with the toxins that these species may put into the soil. Last comparison, there are various things that are associated or parts of climate change. And a recent meta-analysis tried to answer the question, who's better at dealing with that component of climate change, native or invasive species? Elevated CO2 isn't itself climate change, but when there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, plants basically get bigger. So it's a benefit for most plants. And in fact, invasives, which are the red boxes, take better advantage of elevated CO2. So as CO2 goes up, they get a bigger advantage from that. They get a bigger advantage from elevated temperatures also, but they're harmed more by decreased precipitation. So bottom line is there are parts of climate change that will give invasives an advantage. Drought in particular would probably give natives an advantage. My computer is reacting slowly. So those are the 3 components where it does seem to be a difference in the responses. Okay, so what can we say overall about the effects of climate change on native plant species? First of all, there's no question that future changes in temperature and precipitation, and in particular, summer increase in temperature and decrease in precipitation, will be very challenging for all plants, including natives. Natives may be able to deal with drought better, but it's still going to be a challenge. Another challenge is maintaining ecological synchrony. They may lose ecological synchrony with their pollinators due to phenological shifts differing. And it's less likely that they'll lose synchrony if they have a lot of pollinators, and it's more likely they'll lose synchrony if their main pollinators are beetles. If false springs become more common, that it is more or less the belief for our region. If they become more common, it's going to be bad news, very bad news for native species and their pollinators. Probably more for the pollinators than for the native plants. And the interactions between native species and other native plants and pollinators and invasives, those kinds of interactions are going to change in the future because there are different range. Species are shifting idiosyncratically, both in their geographic range, in their phenology. And so there will be new communities, both in space and time, that native species will have to deal with in the future. Whoops, sorry. So really important thing to keep in mind is we have options for what the future is going to be like. And if we want it to be a better future than the one we're heading at, we need to get active right away. One of the things that can do, again, it's reacting slowly to my clicks, is join us on April 19th. There'll be a rally. It's part of our Spring Into Action 2024 series of activities and events. It's actually the culmination of all of the events that are going on and off campus starting in January and ending in April. there's going to be a march. We don't yet know. Well, it's being planned at this point, but it will certainly start at the flagpoles on Western's campus, and it will go down Main Street, joined by a similar march or identical march coming from Kalamazoo College. And this is the kind of thing that you can do that may well make a difference. And what really matters in these kinds of events, I'm virtually certain of this, is how many bodies are there. You don't have to chant, you don't have to carry a sign, you don't have to do anything. But if there are more people, it will definitely get more attention. Okay, so that's an open invitation. Please feel free to join. We think there'll be people of all parts of society joining for it, we hope. Okay, thank you very much for your attention and for tolerating a little bit of overshoot on the time.
Thank you, David. That was very, very interesting. We have just a few questions in the question and answer box.
Okay.
Let's see, the first one is from Martha. Our local land conservancy often makes new oak prairies or other habitats in the 10 years after acquiring new properties. About 5 years ago, they started using mixed seed from all of their properties, including 3 counties to our south, instead of just from their own property next door, and seems to be working well. Is 3 counties to south far enough? Should they start getting seed from their sister land conservancy to our south?
Yeah, I would say yes, they should. I don't know how much of a time buffer 3 counties to the south gives us. I mean, I would be looking at, so by the end of the century, depends on, of course, what emissions scenario we follow. But by end of century, it's likely that Michigan's climate will be like the current climate of Arkansas. But that assumes that we'll do a decent job of reducing emissions. So I would look to areas where that currently have the climate that Southwest Michigan is predicted to have in the future. And I'd probably base my choices more on the business as usual scenario, just to be safe. So I think I don't know how far south you go. 3 counties, probably not far enough. I think states, maybe 3 states would be more appropriate.
Thank you.
But it's good that they're doing it. It's good that they're thinking about it.
Okay, the next one is, should we conclude that planting drought-tolerant plants is a good response to likely future climate change?
Absolutely. Yep. No question. Drought, there's a reason it took 3 billion years for life to get out of water and onto land. And that's that lack of water, desiccation, is a huge mortality cause. So it remains the most deadly severe weather event for terrestrial land life forms of all kinds. I think drought tolerance is going to be the most important trait, allowing species to persist in the future. It would be great if we could breed drought tolerance. It would be great if we could breed the desiccation tolerance of mosses into all of our native species. Of course we can't. And the problem with trying to produce more drought tolerant or heat tolerant varieties is that if the genetic mutations that would result in that benefit, if they don't exist within the population now, you can't make them common. You can't select for it. So, and mutation's a pretty slow process. So the problem is that certainly within the time course of a century, native species are going to have to make do with basically whatever genetic variants they already have. But there's been local adaptation, and that's why the genetic variants that exist in southern populations may be different from what we have here now. And we can, instead of asking our Michigan populations to evolve, which is pretty much a ridiculous ask, we can import from where those versions of the trait have already been favored.
Okay, and our last question. Are there studies of the effects of climate change upon plants that grow in the water?
Great question. Not many that I know of anyway. So yeah, I actually don't, I can't even bring one to mind. Susan may know. No, yeah. So I think it's a lot easier to warm a greenhouse or a chamber, an outdoor chamber, than it is to warm a body of water. So I mean, we have predictions about how much surface waters of still water lakes, ponds will warm, how much the temperature of streams will increase. But I don't know of any. I mean, that's the kind of thing I would love to get invited to give a talk about, because that would force me to go into the literature and see what's there. But yeah, it's a great question. I don't know. One of the things that is a benefit to terrestrial plants of elevated CO2. So as CO2 goes up, terrestrial plants keep their, or land, non-aquatic plants can close their stomates more. So they preserve, they don't lose as much water through their stomates but that also compromises their increased growth. It limits how much the CO2 can stimulate their growth. I would imagine aquatic plants don't have to don't have to do anything to prevent water loss. So they would probably benefit more from elevated CO2. It's not temperature, but elevated CO2 than land-based plants, but I don't know that. Yeah, it's a great question.
And I believe we have one more that's just come in. What local organizations are there that provide opportunities for people to actively engage in the effort to address the climate crisis?
Great question. I mean, there are a lot. So one, Tim Tesser is here. I saw him earlier, or saw his name earlier. I don't know if Marianne Rentz is here too, but they are the leaders of the local chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, which has for many years been trying to get Congress to pass and the president to sign a carbon fee and dividend bill, where basically it's a carbon tax, but the revenue from the tax is returned to all the citizens. And so actually lower income citizens get more back than they pay in increased prices. CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby, I think it meets maybe the first Saturday of the month. But Tim, can you type into, or just come, maybe you can't unmute yourself. So anyway, Citizens Climate Lobby is a great organization to get involved in. We have, Tom mentioned this, on campus, a climate change working group. It's not restricted to faculty. Anybody can join our climate change working group. We meet every other week. We mainly focus on climate education on campus. But there's the Kalamazoo KCCC, Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition, which is really an amalgam of most or all of the environmental groups in the area that also organize activities and, you know, some raising awareness, some demanding change. So I would say CCL and KCCC is what it's called, would be the two places I would start. They're totally focused on climate change.
Thank you. I think we will wrap up this evening. Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate it. This has been a wonderful, fascinating talk.
Well, thank you. Thank you
And,
for inviting me.
Oh, thank you. And I think that with that, we will close this evening and look forward to seeing everyone next month live at the Portage District Library.